Epilepsy, the sacred disease of geniuses and military leaders. The greatest of the heroes, the son of the god Zeus and the mortal woman Alcmene, the unusually strong and brave Hercules, is one of the most popular characters in ancient Greek mythology. The best mentors taught Hercules various arts, wrestling and archery. Since birth, the young man has shown extraordinary physical strength and courage. The supreme god of Olympus wanted Hercules to become the ruler of Mycenae, or Tiryns, but possessive Hera rained on his parade. She struck Hercules with insanity, in a fume of which he killed his wife and 3 of his sons. The ancient Greek dramatist Euripides writes about this in detail in a tragedy called The Madness of Heracles. One day, the hero was performing a sacrifice to his father Zeus. Suddenly, it was as if he was not himself. The whites of his eyes quivered anxiously and became bloodshot, and thick foam dripped from his lips to his beard, and wild, terrible laughter accompanied his words. Heracles began to undress and made such movements as if he was fighting with someone. After that, he grabbed a bow and arrows and killed his wife and children, and then he collapsed to the ground, and dreadful sleep shackled him immediately. When Hercules awoke, he had forgotten all about the attack and was bitter about what he had done. The described symptoms indicate a sudden deterioration of consciousness. Modern psychologists believe that such a rampage of Hercules can serve as a perfect example of an epileptic seizure. According to other mythological legends, he killed not only his children, but also the children of his twin brother Iphicles. Some epileptics are characterized by episodic attacks of angry aggression out of epileptic states as well. As punishment, the priestess soothsayer Pythia ordered Hercules to perform 10 labors. It is thanks to these labors that Hercules is considered the greatest of heroes and has been admired for several millennia. It was in honor of Hercules that epilepsy began to be called Hercules disease. The very word epilepsy comes from the Latin epilepsia and means captured, caught. By the way, not only people suffer from this disease, other mammals are also susceptible to epileptic seizures. For example, dogs, cats, goats, mice are all familiar with the chronic neurological disease, which manifests itself in the predisposition of the body to the sudden onset of convulsive seizures. Epilepsy is perhaps one of the few diseases mentioned in ancient written sources. The well-known written sources of Mesopotamia and Indian Ayurvedic texts describing epilepsy as an independent disease are more than 3,000 years old. The cuneiform tablets of Babylon have a very vivid description of the epileptic status. The demon that a man is possessed by takes possession of him many times in a night, and during the possession the man's hands and feet are cold, his skin darkens, he constantly closes and opens his mouth. All this may go on for a while, but in the end the man dies. Over the centuries, epilepsy has been given many different names. One of it is sacred disease. This is because the ancient Greeks and Romans attributed epileptic seizures to divine intervention. Its manifestations were associated with magic and spiritual powers. For the first time, the term sacred disease is mentioned in the writings of Heraclitus and Herodotus. For example, Heraclitus believed that epilepsy is associated with the indwelling of spirits in the body and is sent to man for his sins. The Persian king Cambyses II was a warlike ruler, the son of the legendary Cyrus the Great. He conquered the lands of Egypt, and the Greek historian Herodotus described his campaigns a few decades later. In his work, History, he recorded references to the fact that Cambyses had a changeable mood and unpredictable behavior. Herodotus believed that Cambyses was subject to the sacred disease, epilepsy. He is said to have been afflicted from his birth with that grievous disease which some call sacred, but it seems incredible that when his body was suffering severely, his mind should have been in pain as well, Herodotus wrote. Scientists still have not found genuine evidence that Cambyses actually had epilepsy. However, in this case, It is also important how Herodotus perceived epilepsy and how his perception influenced the further development of treatment and public perception of the disease. On the one hand, Herodotus stigmatizes epilepsy and claims that it is associated with mental illness. On the other hand, the historian moves away from the then typical notion of epilepsy as a disease sent by the gods. Therefore, his ideas can be considered a transitional link from the perception of epilepsy as a spiritual phenomenon to a scientific one. In 400 BC, Hippocrates wrote the monograph on the sacred disease, dedicated to epilepsy. In it, the ancient Greek healer argued that epilepsy is caused by brain pathology and can be transmitted by inheritance, and attacks of the disease are provoked by external factors, the sun, wind, and cold, which change the consistency of the brain. In ancient Greece and ancient Rome, the view was widespread that epilepsy was a contagious disease. It was believed that from one touch to an epileptic, one could become the prey of a demon. The ancient Greek philosopher Theophrastus wrote, "When anyone sees a madman or an epileptic, he flinches and spits in his direction." The ancient Roman writer Pliny, known as the author of natural history, noted in his work, "In the case of epilepsy, we spit, thus getting rid of the infection." He also described epileptic seizures that happened during public meetings. If this happened, then the Romans interrupted the comitia, and the cases that did not have time to sort out were reviewed later. The Romans believed that an epileptic seizure during a public meeting is a sky sign, and therefore such meetings should be interrupted or rescheduled for another day. The outstanding ancient Roman physician Aretaeus from Cappadocia, who lived in the 1st century BC, also described an epileptic seizure in his writings. He compared the patient with the sight of a bull whose throat was cut. The arms are clenched, the head is laid forward or backward, or brought to the shoulder, and the legs strike in all directions. Egyptian references to the moon sickness, morbus unaticus, have survived to this day. That's what they call epilepsy. The reason for this name was that epileptic seizures are often accompanied by somnambulism. They differ from ordinary sleepwalking in that they often occur immediately after falling asleep and can occur several times a night. But the Arabs defined epilepsy as a convulsive illness and believed that it most often overtakes people precisely in the dark of the moon. According to the great English playwright William Shakespeare, the ancient Roman commander Gaius Julius Caesar also suffered from epilepsy. In the second scene of the second act of Shakespeare's tragedy, The Life and Death of Julius Caesar, there is this quatrain: "He fell down in the marketplace and foamed at mouth and was speechless." It is difficult to say whether Shakespeare was aware of some facts from the life of Caesar or whether everything he described was nothing more than literary fiction. Epilepsy is also mentioned in the Gospel of St. Mark and St. Luke, which describe Christ's healing of a boy from the devil who had taken possession of his body. The father of the child came to Christ and said, "Teacher, I have brought my son to you so you could heal him. He is possessed by an evil spirit that won't let him talk, and whenever this spirit seizes him, it throws him violently to the ground. Then he foams at the mouth and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast out the evil spirit, but they couldn't do it." The boy was brought to Jesus. When the evil spirit saw Jesus, it threw the child into a violent convulsion, and he fell to the ground, writhing and foaming at the mouth. "How long has this been happening?" Jesus asked the boy's father. He replied, "Since he was a little boy. The spirit often throws him into the fire or into the water, trying to kill him." Jesus then said to the unholy one, "Listen, you spirit that makes this boy unable to hear and speak, I command you to come out of this child and never enter him again." Then the spirit screamed and threw the boy into another violent convulsion and left him. The boy appeared to be dead, and people said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and helped him to his feet, and he stood up. Over the following centuries, the attitude toward epileptics was rather negative. Therefore, in anticipation of an attack, the patient often ran away to a deserted place where no one could see him and covered his head. Patients with epilepsy lived in an atmosphere of shame and contempt. In the 10th to 11th centuries, the term falling evil and then falling sickness began to refer to epilepsy. It was assumed that epileptic seizures are not caused by the devil's own power, but occur when the internal balance in the human body is disturbed and it becomes subject to the devil's influence. Not surprisingly, that instead of treating epilepsy, they often resorted to expelling the devil with prayers and holy water. In the 13th century, the Church spread the point of view that the falling sickness can be contracted through the patient's breath. When he falls to the ground foaming, beware of him if you value life. Do not allow anyone to come close, because if his terrible breath gets into the mouth of another person, he can also get sick. In the Middle Ages, attitudes towards epilepsy were ambivalent. On the one hand, epilepsy awakened fear, as a disease that cannot be cured. On the other hand, it was often associated with obsession, trance, observed in saints and prophets. Mahomet, St. John, St. Valentine, Joan of Arc probably suffered from epilepsy. The lack of effective methods of treatment and the unpredictability of seizures led the medieval Inquisition to recognize the sick as possessed and burn them at the stake. The biography of French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, published in 1838, reads as follows. From adolescence, he had epileptic conditions. Once in Paris, at school, for non-compliance with subordination, he was punished by having to eat while kneeling. Due to a severe epileptic seizure that happened to him, he was released from punishment. Even if Napoleon really suffered from epilepsy, and most opinions speak rather in favor than against such a diagnosis, his seizures seem to have been rare and had little effect on his activities. The fact that many great people, Socrates, Plato, Caesar, Joan of Arc, Napoleon, suffered from epilepsy precipitated the spread of the theory that people suffering from this disease are highly intelligent and endowed with talents. Edgar Allan Poe is also invariably mentioned in the list of genius epileptics. His seizures were atypical. The aura preceding the seizure was peculiar, an experience of unusual happiness, a feeling of penetration into the innermost secrets of being. It seemed to the writer that the most inaccessible areas where human thought had not yet penetrated were opening up to him. There was a connection with the past millennia. Poe himself defined these sensations as foggy visions, old, strange, confused ideas from a time when memory did not yet exist. Sometimes the seizure was limited to just this kind of aura. If it arose, then after the aura there was nausea, arms and legs numbness, trembling and falling. After his consciousness was restored, there was a lack of understanding of what was happening to him, and a feeling of acute pain throughout his body. Epileptic seizures also arose at the height of passion, when the writer was too excited and agitated. Often, the writer's epileptic seizures were intertwined with depression. So, after the death of his first lover, Jane Stennard, he had a series of completely monotonous nightmares, which, by the way, is characteristic of epilepsy. In the darkness of the night, an icy hand fell on his face, and a disgusting face approached from the darkness. At the peak of his depression, Poe suddenly disappeared from the house and was brought back, unconscious and exhausted, by random passers-by. In 1844, he experienced the twilight state of consciousness known in psychiatry. During this period, he also suddenly disappeared from home and ended up on a ferry between New York and Jersey. He made several runs on it, asking passengers for the address of a woman he knew, Marie Devereaux, and immediately forgetting this address. Poe also had peculiar relationship with alcohol. Moreover, his binges did not increase gradually but developed immediately, moreover from the consumption of strong drinks and in large quantities. This pattern of alcohol consumption is also specific to patients with epilepsy. It is similar to a sudden attack and is called dipsomania, which suggests a sudden impulsive desire for a drink against a background of depressed mood. In the 18th century, epilepsy began to be identified with insanity and dementia. Patients with epilepsy were forcibly hospitalized in homes for the insane and kept separately from other patients. Forced hospitalization and isolation of the sick continued until 1849. It was then that the first specialized clinics for patients with epilepsy were organized in England. Gustave Flaubert's first epileptic seizures are reported in 1843, when Flaubert was 22 years old. The young man fainted and fell to the carriage floor in front of his brother. The French novelist spoke about his epilepsy in his letters addressed to a friend. Apparently, the epileptic episodes affected the inner balance and social behavior of the writer. My active living ended at the age of 22. My nervousness never left me in peace. Flaubert loved to travel, but a progressive illness, coupled with illiterate treatment, increasingly forced him to stay at home and interfered with the creative process. According to the descriptions of Flaubert himself and some of his contemporaries, it can be assumed that Flaubert felt the approach of his attacks. For example, he had auras. The course of Flaubert's epilepsy was very uneven. After the first epileptic seizure, which occurred at the age of 22, he had 4 seizures during the first 2 weeks. Subsequently, the attacks stopped and were sometimes absent for several years. While working on books, Flaubert had to strain his memory and force himself to concentrate more and more. The disease even changed his handwriting and increased the size of the letters penned by Flaubert with effort. More than one literary source indicates that the painter Vincent William van Gogh also suffered from epilepsy. Modern neurologists interpret his illness as a somnambulistic form of epilepsy. The descriptions of his meltdowns, cutting off his ear, and making a self-portrait in a bandage certainly point to a pathological behavior. Even if not all the obscurities and oddities in Van Gogh's behavior can be explained by epileptic symptoms, as was done in many studies on the artist's illness and in descriptions of his short, exhausting, reckless life, there is no doubt that in the last 2 years of Van Gogh's life, epileptic seizures occurred at irregular intervals. The cause of Van Gogh's epilepsy was not clear. Nevertheless, with a certain probability, we can talk about symptomatic epilepsy, that is, of a chronic nature. This could have been facilitated by a difficult long-term birth, which affected the deviation in behavior already in childhood. Van Gogh had both focal epileptic seizures, which occurred in one specific part of the brain, and generalized ones, when the epileptic discharge spread to both hemispheres. The presence of localized foci of epilepsy occurrence usually indicates an early organic lesion of the central nervous system. For centuries, epilepsy has been treated with fear and misunderstanding. People with epilepsy have been discriminated against and socially stigmatized. The history of attitudes towards epilepsy is associated with many prejudices, which were perceived as scientific data for a long time. So, in the 19th century, it was believed that there was a lot in common between epilepsy and propensity to violence and inclination to aggression. In particular, this point of view was held by the Italian psychiatrist Cesare Lombroso, who saw degenerative signs in epileptics, which, in his opinion, were characteristic of criminals. There was also a point of view that epilepsy is a purely hereditary disease, and that an epileptic gives birth to an epileptic. This eugenic point of view lasted for a very long time. So, in the United States until the end of World War II, in some states, there were laws prohibiting patients with epilepsy from marrying, having children, and even calling for their forced sterilization. In the 20th century, scientific and cultural progress led to the destruction of these concepts. Epileptics were no longer considered aggressive by default, and the hereditary nature of epilepsy has also been refuted. Few people know, but Lady Agatha Christie, who lived a long and certainly rich life, suffered from epilepsy. The English writer has published more than 60 detective novels, 6 psychological novels, and 19 short story collections. 16 of her plays have been staged in London. Agatha Christie's books have sold over 2 billion copies and have been translated into more than 100 languages around the world. She also holds the record for the most theatrical productions of works. In some Agatha novels, epileptics are mentioned as examples of people who need sympathy and support. Nevertheless, the attitude of society towards persons suffering from epilepsy remained ambiguous and mostly negative for a long time. People with epilepsy are often stigmatized to this day. This can affect the quality of life of both people with epilepsy and their families. In some countries, social stigma and discrimination against people with this condition are more difficult to overcome than the epileptic seizures themselves. People with epilepsy may face barriers such as limited access to health and life insurance, being denied a driver's license, and barriers to obtaining certain professions. Legislation in many countries reflects certain prejudices against epilepsy. For example, in China and India, epilepsy often becomes a reason for the prohibition or annulment of marriages. In the UK until 1971, there was a law allowing the annulment of marriage due to epilepsy. In the United States until the 1970s, people with epilepsy could legally be denied access to restaurants, theaters, entertainment centers, and other public buildings. In 1990, laws were passed in the United States and in 1992 in the United Kingdom and Australia to prohibit discrimination against people with epilepsy. And at the same time, in Poland and Japan, a person with this diagnosis is deprived of the right to drive a car for life. Although, according to the recommendations of the International Bureau of Epilepsy, the period from the last seizure, allowing a person diagnosed with epilepsy to raise the issue of obtaining a driver's license, should be 2 years. Canadian rock musician Neil Young first experienced a mild epileptic seizure as a teenager. Presumably, poliomyelitis he suffered earlier provoked the attack. For a long time, the illness was mild, but one day Young had a severe epileptic seizure right on stage. The attacks were recurring, and from a certain moment, the musician began to lose his sight. He also suffered from headaches. Doctors diagnosed a brain aneurysm and performed an operation on the musician. After the surgery, Young continues to give concerts and record music. In the 19th century, psychiatric writers suggested that epileptic seizures caused personality destruction. At the beginning of the 20th century, the opinion was established that both epilepsy and personality changes in this disease are a consequence of some general underlying pathology. There was also a widespread notion according to which the epileptic personality was characterized as self-centered, irritable, quarrelsome, and stubborn with sticky thinking. Later, it became apparent that these ideas arose from observations of severely ill patients with serious brain damage who were constantly staying within the 4 walls of the clinics. A survey of patients with epilepsy living in society has led to the conclusion that only a minority of them experience difficulties due to personality anomalies, and if such personality problems do occur, they usually do not have any specific character. For example, there is very little evidence to support the hypothesis of an association between epilepsy and aggressiveness. Many people with epilepsy do not have mental and intellectual impairments. In the intervals between epileptic seizures, the frequency of which varies significantly in different cases, most people with epilepsy are no different from healthy people. If mental disorders or mental retardation are present in epilepsy, these disorders are usually due to either the underlying severe brain disease or the insufficient effectiveness of anti-epileptic drugs. The probable cause of the first and subsequent epileptic seizures in Elton John could be a drug overdose, from which the musician almost died. Since then, Elton John has been able to overcome his addiction with the help of rehabilitation. He has not used drugs for 30 years. However, he still has epileptic seizures from time to time. The musician prefers to talk about epilepsy as rarely as possible. A typical epileptic seizure starts suddenly. For short moments, some patients feel certain manifestations preceding the attack. Sometimes it's like a slight breeze on the face, flashes of red light, a sensation of enlargement of objects, lengthening of one's own arms or legs, a hallucinatory perception of whistling, drumming, a peculiar smell, a feeling of sucking in the epigastric region, numbness of the tongue, the approach of something huge, fear or ecstasy, a different sense of time. It is interesting that often all the smallest details of the aura, the state preceding the fit, are experienced by the patient invariably, repeating with each attack. Despite the fact that the patient knows what his aura means, he does not always have time to sit or lie down. Instead, many people with epilepsy just fall to the ground, often with a high-pitched scream. The face turns pale, consciousness becomes dimmed. The mouth and face are contorted, the head turns to the side, the whole body is drawn out by a tonic spasm. Foam appears on the lips, often stained with blood from the bitten tongue or cheeks. Eyes roll back, pupils dilate, and do not respond to light. Breathing is first suspended, then becomes hoarse and labored. Soon, the pallor of the face is replaced by a blue-purple color. The pulse weakens. This period of tonic convulsions lasts from a few seconds to half a minute. Then the tension gradually subsides, first in individual muscle groups, and then throughout the body. Clonic seizures begin to run. Soon they cover all the muscles of the body, sweat comes out, involuntary urination occurs. The patient does not react to external stimuli. His or her reflexes fade away. Body temperature usually rises. The period of rhythmic flexion and extension lasts 3 to 4 minutes, giving way to a general weakening, and sometimes a number of unconscious movements and incoherent mumbling. The entire epileptic seizure rarely lasts more than 5 minutes. Attempts to treat epilepsy have been made at all times since its existence became known. However, ideas about the origin of this disease as godforsaken determined the main methods of treatment. Basically, these were magic methods of influence: spells, amulets, special necklaces, the use of plants and animals endowed with magical properties, as well as other methods of protection from demons. It was not without spiritual help to the sick. Prayers. Many of these treatments for epilepsy are now difficult to take seriously. For example, the use of amulets from dried scorpions or frog legs. But some of the old methods were also built on the basis of certain pathophysiological mechanisms for suppressing epileptic activity. For example, in ancient Egypt, a patient with epilepsy, with the onset of a seizure, sought to quickly cover themselves with a dark cloth. Millennia will pass, and scientists will learn that being in the dark stimulates the production of melatonin in the body, and one of the properties of melatonin is the suppression of seizures and their predisposition to them. In other words, melatonin is able to improve the clinical outcome of epilepsy. Later, herbal medicine began to be used. In the treatment of epilepsy, mainly herbal preparations with a calming effect were used. Another common treatment for epilepsy was the use of metals. As early as in ancient Greece, copper was first used as an anticonvulsant drug, and the medieval Swiss alchemist Paracelsus was the first to use lapis imperialis, silver nitrate, for the treatment of epilepsy. Except for treating epilepsy, he used it to fight jaundice and a number of other diseases. During the Renaissance, various chemicals were widely used to treat epilepsy. Copper was most often used, a little less often, zinc oxide, silver nitrate, mercury, bismuth, and tin. Physical treatments were also used, such as cold showers or baths, infusions of ice-cold water into the bladder, enemas, and saline infusions. Of course, all these methods were ineffective, and epilepsy was considered an incurable disease. Pharmacological treatment of epilepsy only began in the 19th century, and it is still the main one. It officially began on May 11, 1857, when Sir Charles Locock, 1st Baronet, in a publication in the famous British medical journal The Lancet, described the use of potassium bromide to treat the so-called hysterical epilepsy in 15 women. At that time, patients with hysteria were traditionally placed in the epileptic department. A number of mental illnesses, united by the concept of hysteria, were characterized, among other things, by pseudoconvulsions, false loss of sensitivity, false deafness and dumbness, the experience of possession, and not just that. As a result, physicians did not see much difference between an epileptic seizure and hysteria. Coincidentally, potassium bromide has both an anticonvulsant and a sedative effect. That is, it not only stops involuntary muscle contraction, but also has a calming, even hypnotic effect. That is, in fact, potassium bromide has demonstrated its effectiveness in the treatment of hysteria, but it has also been used for epilepsy. At that time, aqueous solutions of sodium bromide and potassium bromide were collectively referred to as bromine. This explains the fact that later physicians experimented with both of these salts. Later, they also began to create various mixtures based on bromides, mixing them with calabar beans, belladonna, atropine sulfate, and digitalis. The German neurologist Paul Flechsig mixed bromides with opium. For a long time, the mechanism of action of bromine preparations remained unknown. It was believed that bromides reduced the excitatory tendency, acting similarly to sleeping pills. Only in 1910, scientists came to the conclusion that bromides enhance the processes of inhibition in the central nervous system. Therefore, the search for more effective and less toxic agents was obvious. Now, sodium and potassium bromides are scarcely used in the treatment of internal human diseases, but they are widely used in veterinary medicine, for example, epilepsy in dogs. For 50 years, sodium bromide was the only remedy for epilepsy, and only in 1912 did the German psychiatrist and neurologist Alfred Hauptmann discover the anticonvulsant properties of phenobarbital. Initially, he gave it to patients with epilepsy as a common tranquilizer, but soon noticed a decrease in the number of seizures in such patients. After a thorough long-term study, the physician saw a significant improvement in their condition compared with bromides. But, as the scientists assumed, this remedy did not cure epilepsy, and when it was withdrawn, the seizures returned again. For the next 40 years, phenobarbital remained the first-tier drug. In 1979, in honor of the merits of the German scientist, the Hauptmann Prize for the Scientific Research of Epilepsy was founded. With the advent of phenobarbital, ideas about epilepsy have fundamentally changed. Previously, it used to be believed that there was no effective remedy for this disease. Now, doctors have come to the conclusion that it answers to a treatment. Patients with epilepsy have a chance to gain freedom from seizures. People suffering from epileptic seizures have the hope of recovery. However, the first joy was alloy, when the side effects of phenobarbital became apparent against the background of long-term treatment. These included lodginess, drowsiness, impaired memory and attention, and conduct disorder. The next important step in the development of the pharmacology of anticonvulsants was the discovery of the anticonvulsant properties of phenytoin. This medication was synthesized by the German chemist Heinrich Blitz in 1908, but its properties were finally studied only in 1938. It was then that scientists discovered that phenytoin has anti-epileptic properties. It was much more effective than phenobarbital and did not have a depressing effect on the brain. Since the beginning of phenytoin use, there has been evidence that it differs not only in anticonvulsant properties. Reports have been published of a marked improvement in personality traits, mood, emotional stability, and the appearance of a sense of comfort in patients taking the drug. The discovery of phenytoin had two fundamental implications. First, it showed that sedative and hypnotic action is not a necessary feature of anti-epileptic properties. Secondly, unlike bromides and phenobarbital, it was the first purposeful discovery instead of being accidental. However, as it turned out, phenytoin has some side effects, although in this case they are more of a cosmetic nature. People who take this remedy have roughening of the facial features, gum hyperplasia, loss of hair. In fact, until the 70s of the last century, drugs for the treatment of epilepsy, which were at the doctor's disposal, included phenobarbital and phenytoin. Due to the marked side effects of these anti-epileptic medicines, and also due to the fact that the effective treatment could not be achieved in all patients, the search for other, more advanced medicines continued. In the 1960s through 1970s, the synthesis of new anticonvulsants intensified. If the same bromides were used for 55 years from 1857 to 1912, having no alternative, then over these 2 decades, several classes of anticonvulsants appeared at once: benzodiazepines, imanostilbene derivatives, valproates. In the following decades, topiramate, oxcarbazepine, tiazabine, and more were added to them. To date, anticonvulsant drugs, the use of which can continue throughout a person's life, are mainly used in the treatment of epilepsy. The choice of anticonvulsant depends on the type of seizures, epilepsy syndromes, health status, and other medications the patient is taking. In the beginning, it is recommended to use just one medicine. If there is a lack of the desired effect, it is recommended to switch to another one. 2 medications are taken at the same time only if one does not work. Approximately in half of the cases, the first remedy is effective. The second gives an effect of about 13%. A third, or a combination of the two, can help another 4%. About 30% of people keep having seizures despite treatment with anticonvulsants. In April 2018, the FDA Advisory Board recommended the registration of a medicine based on cannabidiol. Its purpose is the treatment of severe forms of epilepsy in children. If approved by the regulator, the drug will become the first registered medical marijuana drug in the United States. To date, approximately 70% of cases can achieve absolute remission. In half of these patients, doctors eventually completely cancel pharmaceutical treatment. However, it should be noted that a prerequisite for achieving remission is strict compliance with the prescribed treatment. Sincerely yours, Dr. PopMed.